In this video, I want to talk about ordinary and preferred shares, the features of these types of instruments, what rights they give to the shareholders, be it ordinary or preferred shareholders. We're going to focus quite a bit on the preferred shares to discuss the differences between cumulative, non-cumulative preferred shares, participating, non-participating, as well as going back to ordinary shares, different types of voting arrangements that may appear. Now, these topics make perfect ground for theoretical questions in your exam. So even though you may know quite a bit about how shares are valued, how shares are traded, there are these, let's say, more theoretical aspects that you still need to be aware of in order to score good marks on the exam. So let me start off by saying something very basic. Well, ordinary or preferred shares, they are equity securities, aren't they? So if I put down the title or the name equity securities over here, and both types of shares are definitely representatives of equity instruments or equity securities, I want to say that they represent, this is a point which your curriculum makes on a number of occasions, that these represent what's called a residual claim. Now I'll explain this in a moment. A residual claim on a company's net assets. Net assets. Net assets means assets minus liabilities or assets minus obligations. So basically the assets of a business that remain after all of its obligations have been settled. If you are the holder of equity securities, you are entitled to, that residual part. And this is especially the net assets. This is especially going to be important in case of a company's liquidation, in case of a company being wound down. Now, in contrast to debt instruments or debt securities, right? So unlike debt, the issuer of equity securities has absolutely no contractual obligation to repay the amounts received. So there's not going to be, a maturity date when you're given back money. Repay amounts received, unlike with debt. And on top of that, there's no contractual obligation to make any sort of periodic payments to the holders of these securities. So periodic payments to shareholders, be it preferred or ordinary. So once again, maybe let me write this down. Unlike in the case of debt securities, where such an obligation exists. And one final point, which your curriculum does make, and I want to make it as well before we go into a sort of full-on discussion of the features of ordinary and preferred shares and the rights associated with them, etc., is that shareholders obviously are the owners of a business, of the company, the business. And as such, the returns or the yields that they generate are going to be a function of two things, or they're going to be composed of two things. On the one hand, they're going to typically, not always, but typically receive some form of current income. Well, not some form, it takes the form of a dividend, which is a payment made by the company to them out of profits generated. But on top of this, they typically are also hoping for some capital appreciation because they are the co-owners of the business. They hope that business will grow in value. So not only will they receive a current income stream, but also potentially also growth in value of the securities which they hold, which is sort of apart from the dividend receipt. Obviously, in the case of debt, providers of debt or debt holders, in terms of their returns, it's much more about just the income bit. It's called interest or a coupon, isn't it? If you buy bonds, you get a coupon, or interest. If you give somebody a loan, you just get interest. But there isn't really that capital appreciation element unless you are providing or buying distressed securities issued by companies in trouble which trade at a large discount, and things go right. The company is able to repay their bonds, and then you get that capital appreciation bit as well. With that, you're not really most of the time sharing in the capital appreciation, which is to do with growth in company value. Okay, with those introductory remarks about the nature of equity securities and the returns typically expected by equity holders, we can now get into the meat of this topic, which is the differences between ordinary and preferred stock or shares. So let me draw one arrow to the left-hand side, one arrow to the other side, and say and state accordingly on this side ordinary shares, but we often call them common. I'm not going to say shares, we know it's shares. Ordinary and common are synonyms, so you may say ordinary shares or common. It's often, typical to say stock instead of shares. So ordinary shares or common stock, or some variant of these two words. Whereas on this side, I'm going to say, well, I use the title in the title preferred shares. They may be either called preferred or preference shares or preference stock. Same thing. No difference between these. I'm going to start on the left-hand side. After all, this is the predominant type of share you're going to find out there in the world of business. So ordinary or common shareholders, those who hold such shares, they obviously have certain features, or they enjoy certain rights and features. For example, these are the people who are going to participate in the operating performance of the business. And I'll tell you what I mean by this. Let me just first write this down. Performance of the business. They receive a dividend, which is paid out of the company's profits. And obviously, profits are impacted by operating performance. Hence, they participate in that performance in terms of the income they receive, and also in terms of capital appreciation of the instruments which they hold. Shares go up in value or down with value together, or in line with the sort of performance of the business, or at least that's what we typically assume. Shareholders or ordinary shareholders also have that, and this is something I've already written down, they have that residual claim on the company's net assets. Net assets, so that's assets minus obligations, in case of the company's liquidation. If a company goes into liquidation, they get whatever is shared between them, whatever is kind of left. And let me also say that ordinary shareholders, they may, but let me underline this term may, they may receive a dividend. There is nothing obliging the company contractually to pay shareholders a dividend. Dividends are distributions made out of profit. But even if a company is generating a profit or has generated a profit for a period, it doesn't mean that a dividend will automatically be paid to ordinary shareholders. The directors of the company, it's typically the directors functioning in the board of directors who may potentially take the decision that it's a better idea to keep the profits within the business, reinvest those profits, retain those profits within the company, as opposed to paying a current dividend to shareholders, to ordinary shareholders. Now, one additional point, and very important one, it's not by no means some minor point, is that ordinary shareholders have the right to vote. So they enjoy voting rights, or they possess voting rights. Although in reality, how many voting rights they've got and whether they do have such voting rights at all will sometimes be determined by what class of ordinary shares they hold. So even though I said over here ordinary common shareholders, treating this as kind of one category, let me write to the side over here that companies may in fact issue different or numerous classes of ordinary shares. Different classes of ordinary shares, typically called Class A, Class B, and potentially other letters as well. And depending on whether you hold Class A or Class B or some other class of ordinary shares, the rights which you possess, the rights which those shares award you, may be different. And this may, for example, be very clear when it comes to voting rights. In some companies, Class A shares have voting rights, whereas Class B shares don't. But they participate equally in a dividend. Just one example, which is actually, I think, given in your curriculum as well. Now, when it comes to voting rights, this gives shareholders, ordinary shareholders, the opportunity to exercise governance. Governance as in the power to, in some way, contribute to how a company is run. And when do you get the chance to vote? Well, voting typically happens at the annual general meeting, the AGM, annual general meeting of shareholders. Companies sometimes sometimes also convene so-called extraordinary general meetings of shareholders beyond that sort of annual event. Very often in case of a major sort of situation, like maybe a company has received a takeover offer which needs to be voted on by the ordinary shareholders, that's when it may decide to convene an extraordinary general meeting. Besides that, we typically have that annual general meeting of shareholders. Now, one of the important things, or typical things that will be voted on during the AGM, is deciding on the makeup, deciding on the composition. So this is just an example, e.g. deciding on the composition of the board of directors, right? And the board of directors gets voted on, or candidates for the board of directors get voted on, newly appointed directors or directors who hope to join the board. Those who want to be reappointed to the board are also voted on. Now, one very specific feature of this that you need to appreciate, you need to understand, is how this voting may happen, because there are two types of voting which your curriculum talks about. One is called statutory voting, and the other is called cumulative voting. And please appreciate how these differ. In the case of statutory voting, one ordinary share equals one vote. Simply, right? So, for example, consider this. Let's say an investor has 10 shares. Investor has 10 shares, ordinary shares. And when it comes to selecting the board of directors, there are 8 board of director positions to be voted on, or seats to be voted on. Voted on. If that's the case, under statutory voting, the shareholder or the investor can potentially give or use 10 votes, because they've got 10 shares, 10 votes for each candidate being voted on. However, under this notion of cumulative voting, what's going to happen is it gives you the possibility, as your curriculum says, to direct, that's the actual phrase used in the curriculum, your cumulative votes, your total votes, to just one candidate, to a specific candidate. So potentially what one could do here is say, oh, my total votes is the number of shares that I've got, 10, times the number of directors being elected, or voted on. So that's times number 8. You've got 80 votes, and these 80 votes can be used to vote for a single candidate, potentially giving them a lot more backing. So this can be used in favor of a single candidate, or it can, in any sort of flexible way that the investor wishes, spread among the candidates. So it doesn't have to be 80 for one person. It could be 60 for one, 5 for somebody else, none for somebody else, etc., etc. So what your curriculum states, and this is something you need to appreciate, the consequence of this. Let me delineate this from the discussion that's going to follow on preferred shares, is that cumulative voting gives smaller shareholders a larger, a better representation, possibly a better representation when it comes to the on the board of directors, when it comes to the composition of the board, because they can use their cumulative votes in favor of individual candidates. Let's move over here to preferred or preference shares. I'm going to say quite a lot about them, and it will not all fit in over here. So I'm just going to make some initial comments and then make space for more. Preference shares or preferred stock. Well, why are they preferred? Well, for one, they rank above the ordinary shares, or shareholders holding preferred or preference shares hold above ordinary shares when it comes in the receipt of a dividend or payment of a dividend. As you will see in just a moment, a dividend that is declared to preferred shareholders comes before a dividend to ordinary shareholders in a sort of hierarchy, plus in the event of, or in case of liquidation. Once again, these people obviously get a distribution out of net assets, but it's not just a residual amount, distribution out of the company's net assets. What they should receive is, let me write this down, preferred shareholders received receive, a pre-specified, a predetermined face value or par value or liquidation value. And this is kind of written into the agreement, into the prospectus, into the terms of the issue. And they have to receive their stated amount first. And only once they've received what was kind of promised to them, can any money be distributed among the ordinary shareholders. But there's nothing kind of saying, there's nothing certain about them even receiving this. So if there isn't enough for them, they will not receive the amounts they were hoping for. But if they can't receive them fully, then nothing can be paid to ordinary shareholders. So what will happen? Let's go back to the notion of the dividend. This is an important one. What will happen is, typically, this dividend is actually a fixed dividend, which needs to be paid to the preferred shareholders before anything can be distributed among the ordinary shareholders. I'll show you how that works in just a moment. So that fixed dividend makes preferred shares a bit like debt, doesn't it? Because with debt, you typically receive a fixed coupon. And you could say that because of this fixed nature of the dividend, it's typically stated as a percentage of par value, like, 6% annually of face or par value. That makes it very much like that, debt instruments. And because of this, you could say that the preference shareholders or preferred shareholders do not really, just like debt holders, share in the performance of the business of the company, because how much dividend they receive is not really a true function of how well the company is performing, at least to some extent. But at the same time, despite this being a fixed dividend, there is nothing to say that it has to be paid. A dividend, after all, is paid out of profits, and companies don't always have a profit. So if, for example, there is no profit, it may be difficult to actually pay a dividend unless a company has profits from previous periods, which still remain available as a kind of reserve fund for future dividends. So there is no contractual obligation to pay that dividend, which makes, once again, this instrument similar, but this time not to debt, but to equity, like normal equity, shares, which either pay you a dividend or they don't. So what your curriculum is very insistent on stating is that preferred shares may be viewed as a bit of a hybrid that contains features of both debt because of the fixed dividend nature, but also equity because of the fact that it's not a contractual obligation of the issuer. And let me state some more very important facts. These shares, they may be, or typically are, so preferred shares may be, and in reality typically are, perpetual in their nature in terms of not having any fixed predetermined maturity date, but at the same time, a lot of them are callable or puttable, which means that either the issuer, that's going to be the case with callable preferred shares, or perhaps the owner, the shareholder, will have the ability to call them back. That's in the case of the issuer calling them back and redeeming them for a predefined amount, or maybe the investor is able to put them back and put them up for redemption to the issuer. And that typically becomes possible from a certain date. There is a date on which the shares become first callable or puttable. Now, I think the most important feature here is that typically preferred shares carry no voting rights. they don't give you the right to vote, which once again kind of makes them draws similarities, or allows us to draw similarities to debt instruments. You do not, if you're a debt holder, you don't really have much of a say in how the company is run, unless you're a bank and you've given a big loan to a company, and you may influence certain operating decisions of the bank, of the borrower. Nevertheless, in terms of securities, holders of debt securities don't exercise governance, and holders of preferred shares typically have no voting rights. They've got a special fixed dividend, but no voting rights. Okay, I did say that there was more to come on the topic of preference shares, and I now want to show you how we deal with preferred dividends. We previously said that they are typically fixed, and the thing is, even though these dividends are fixed, there is no contractual obligation for the company to pay that fixed dividend. And the question is, what happens if a company decides not to pay the preferred dividend, or indeed is unable to do so? Whatever the reason for not paying it, what happens next? Well, let's note for sure that if the company does not pay the preferred dividend, it should not be able to pay an ordinary dividend to the common shareholders. So it cannot pay an ordinary dividend, any dividend to ordinary shareholders. That is realistically the consequence of not paying a preferred dividend. However, there are two possible treatments of that missed dividend, and it all depends on whether we are dealing with cumulative preference shares or indeed non-cumulative preference shares. So, non-cumulative preference shares. So even though these two arrows seem to be stemming out of ordinary shares, it's not about the split of ordinary shares, it's about the split of these preference shares into two types. And whenever you invest in preference shares, you should be aware of which type you are actually dealing with. Cumulative preference shares cause the unpaid or missed dividend to accrue. Unpaid or missed dividend accrues. It accumulates. It doesn't get in any sort of way cancelled, so it accrues and gets carried forward. Into the future. So, in the future, at a later point in time, what the company should do is pay to the preference shareholders both the previously missed but carried forward dividend, plus the present portion of the fixed dividend, preferred dividend, before it can pay any dividend out to ordinary shareholders. In the case of the second type, the non-cumulative preference shares, obviously here there's going to be no accrual of the missed dividend, no carry forward of it, and that missed dividend is permanently forfeited, so lost forever. Okay, so from a shareholder perspective, investor perspective, in preference shares, cumulative is definitely the preferential, is the better type. So these are two types of preference shares. However, another split which you need to be aware of And this is a completely different sort of way of splitting shares. Has nothing to do with the accumulation or non-accumulation of preferred dividends. Is to split them into participating and non-participating preference shares. Now, bear in mind that cumulative shares, preference shares may be non-participating or participating. Non-cumulative preference shares may at the same time be participating or non-participating. So this is just another dimension across which we can classify. Has nothing to do with the previous split. So let's start with the participating ones. These types of shares definitely pay the fixed dividend. So they offer the typical fixed dividend associated with preferred shares. But on top of that fixed dividend, they also offer something additional. An additional dividend, but if certain conditions are met. If the profits of the company typically exceed a pre-specified level. So if performance is good, then you also kind of participate in that extra performance, in that good performance. And on top of this, they may also feature or include an extra payment out of net assets in case of liquidation. So if a company is liquidated, what these shareholders may receive is something extra above the sort of classic just face value or par value. Now, bear in mind that liquidations, we typically associate them with a sort of with something with a very negative event when a company goes bankrupt. But you can liquidate a company also if you just decide to wind it down, and in which case it doesn't have to be a drastic event marking the culmination of some extreme catastrophe or crisis. It can be just a liquidation where the owners of the business decide to stop running it, in which case participating preference shareholders may receive something extra on top of the face value or par value. Now, obviously, in the case of non-participating preference shares, these ones do, as always, pay that fixed dividend. But there is no additional sharing profits of the business. And obviously also upon liquidation, or in the case of liquidation, company liquidation, investors receive the face or par value or liquidation value of those shares only, and nothing, that's a Y over here, only, and nothing on top or nothing extra. Okay, good. So hopefully that's clear. Obviously, non-participating preference shares are the more typical type, but as I said before, you can have any combination of cumulative, participating, non-participating, or non-cumulative, participating, non-participating shares. So these relate to completely different sort of criteria. Now, I've got a bit of space over here, so I just want to talk about a final point when it comes to preference shares, and those are convertible preference shares. Convertible preference shares are obviously shares that give the holders the right to acquire, to convert into a pre-specified, this is known up front, number of ordinary shares in the issuing company. And this pre-specified number of ordinary shares, this is already sort of pre-specified at the issuance date. So when you buy these securities, you know what's going to be the conversion rate or the conversion factor. And I just want to share with you some, some advantages, some benefits of possibly investing in these as your curriculum gives them. Well, it says convertible preference shares, especially if you compare them to ordinary shares, they may give you a higher dividend. Okay, fair enough. If that dividend can be paid. So this is potentially a higher dividend. Definitely an opportunity to share in the performance of the business, because there is that possibility to convert into ordinary shares, become an ordinary shareholders, and ordinary shareholders definitely have that connection with the business performance. And as which they feel via not just the ordinary dividend, but also via capital appreciation, possibly. On top of this, the opportunity to profit from price appreciation, share price appreciation. It will be more and more increasingly advantageous to convert. There's nothing forcing you to convert into ordinary shares, but it will become increasingly advantageous as the stock price goes up of ordinary shares. Then you will likely forego receiving the face value of the preferred share, and choose to receive a certain specific number of ordinary shares in the company. And a final point, lower price volatility as compared to ordinary shares. These types of shares, because they're preference shares, they offer you a fixed dividend, and that fixed dividend is known, so it introduces an element of stability into an evaluation formula, and that sort of consequently leads to lower volatility in terms of price fluctuations, or more stability. Now, one point which your curriculum makes is that such trades or such issues are popular in venture capital. So I'm just going to say VC over here as an acronym for venture capital, where you are, as an investor, making an equity investment into a higher risk company, and you want to make the investment, but you want to have a more predictable, more stable investment, with a known dividend level, potentially. But also the ability to, if things go right, if the business into which you invested proves to be successful, you want to have that opportunity to convert into ordinary shares and just ride the wave of share price appreciation, capital appreciation. Okay, well, that's enough on the differences between ordinary and preferred shares, covering the relevant topic in the curriculum, I feel, quite comprehensively. Thanks for watching.